Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're diving into some choppy waters, the
Yeah.
trade tensions between the US and Canada.
Right.
I know. You've probably seen the headlines
Everyone's talking about it.
about President Trump's tariff threats, but we're going beyond those headlines today,
Absolutely.
digging deeper into the nuances you might not be hearing about on the news.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people are just reading those headlines
Right, exactly.
and not really looking at the details.
Yeah, and that's what we like to do here.
That's what we do.
So,
What's interesting here is that President Trump is threatening tariffs despite Canada's efforts to, address his concerns.
okay, so let's get into specifics.
Yeah, let's do that.
We're talking a potential 25% tariff on almost all Canadian goods, with a 10% hit specifically on energy.
Right.
But Canada's already been working on the issues Trump initially brought up, like border security and drug trafficking, right?
That's right.
Oh.
Canada's actually ramped up security at the border, appointed a fentanyl czar, and even the data shows they were already seizing more drugs coming into Canada than the U.S. was seizing coming from Canada.
Hold on, that's really interesting.
It's pretty surprising.
It sounds like Canada was already doing what Trump asked for.
It seems that way, yeah.
So help me understand, what would a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods actually look like?
Right.
How would this affect everyday people?
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
Like our listeners.
Think about it this way. The Canadian maple syrup you love on your pancakes.
Oh, yeah.
Get ready to pay 25% more for it.
Oh, wow.
Or picture yourself shopping for a new car and suddenly that Canadian-made model.
Right.
Your iron jumps up in price by thousands of dollars.
Thousands.
We're talking about a massive range of products that could be affected.
Wow.
From lumber and steel used in construction to the food we buy at the grocery store.
Wow, that's a real hit to the wallet.
It is, yeah.
But wasn't there also talk about a massive trade deficit between the U.S. and Canada?
There was.
Isn't that part of Trump's reasoning here?
That's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Trump keeps mentioning this huge trade deficit, even throwing out numbers like $200 billion.
Right, I remember that, yeah.
However, that figure doesn't tell the whole story. When you factor out oil imports,
Okay.
the U.S. actually has a trade surplus with Canada.
Wait, a surplus?
Yeah,
So the U.S. is making money from its trade relationship with Canada.
that's right.
Help me understand this better. Why is there this discrepancy?
Well, the U.S. imports a lot of oil from Canada,
Right.
which skews the overall trade figures. But if we look at other sectors like manufactured goods and services,
Okay.
the U.S. actually exports more to Canada than it imports. It's also worth noting that Trump himself renegotiated the North American trade deal, CUSMA,
Yeah,
and touted it as the best deal ever made at the
I
time.
remember that, yeah.
So his current rhetoric seems to contradict his past actions.
Okay, so we've got potential price hikes for consumers, a trade deficit claim that's been debunked,
Right.
and a history of flip-flopping on trade deals. It seems like a lot of mixed signals,
At least. Yeah.
to say the least. Given all this, what are the potential economic implications of these tariffs for both countries?
Well,
Well,
the fallout could be pretty significant.
okay.
Economists are already predicting a potential recession in Canada, and job losses in both countries are a real possibility.
Wow.
Certain industries, like the auto industry,
Right.
which is highly integrated across both countries,
Yeah.
could hit especially hard.
So this isn't just some abstract economic theory.
Correct.
This could really impact people's livelihoods.
Definitely.
Even our listeners. Could someone listening right now potentially lose their job because of these tariffs?
Absolutely. I imagine you work at an auto plant that relies on parts from Canada.
Right.
If those parts suddenly become 25% more expensive, your company might have to cut back on production
Yeah.
or even lay off workers.
Wow.
Or if you're a consumer who regularly buys Canadian goods,
Yeah.
get ready to see your grocery bills and other expenses go up.
Okay, so we're talking potential job losses, higher prices for everyone,
Right.
and a whole lot of economic uncertainty.
Yeah, a lot of unknowns right now.
It sounds pretty bleak, but we also have to look at the political motivations behind all of this, right?
We do.
Is this really about trade and border security, or is there something else going on?
That's the key question we have to consider. If these tariffs are driven by genuine economic concerns,
Right.
or if they're more about political posturing and appealing to a specific base,
Okay.
maybe even distracting from other issues.
You're saying there could be a deeper political game being played here.
It's possible, yeah.
Like a way to stir up nationalistic feelings or
Right.
shift attention away from domestic problems.
Exactly. We also need to think about how these tariffs might affect upcoming elections
Yeah.
in both countries. Could they be used as a political tool to rally support
Right.
or discredit opponents?
This is starting to feel less like economics and more like a game of political chess.
That's a good way to put it. We can't take these pronouncements at face value.
Right.
We need to ask ourselves, who benefits from this situation and who stands to lose?
Okay.
What are the underlying political dynamics at play?
Okay, so we've talked about the potential economic fallout, the political motivations behind these tariffs,
Right.
and Canada's efforts to address Trump's concerns.
Yeah.
But what options does Canada actually have in response to this threat?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Can they fight back, or do they just have to take it?
It's a tough spot for Canada. They've already taken significant steps to address the issues Trump raised.
Yeah,
And publicly caving to further demands could be politically damaging.
I see.
But at the same time, they don't want to trigger a full-blown trade war.
So what are they actually doing?
Right.
What are their options here?
They're walking a tightrope,
Uh-huh.
emphasizing the strong economic ties
Right.
between the two countries and trying to maintain a diplomatic approach.
Okay.
They're also looking for potential allies on the international stage, countries that might be similarly concerned about U.S. protectionist policies.
So are they looking for support from other countries who might be feeling the same pressure from the U.S.?
Exactly. Canada is trying to make the case that these tariffs aren't just a bilateral issue,
Okay.
but a threat to the rules-based international trading system.
Right.
They're hoping to build a coalition of like-minded countries
Yeah.
to push back against what they see as U.S. protectionism.
That's a pretty bold move. But speaking of pushing back, are there any legal challenges Canada could pursue within the framework of the USMCA?
That's definitely an option.
Okay.
The USMCA does have dispute settlement mechanisms that Canada could invoke.
Right.
However, those processes can be lengthy and complex,
Sure.
and there's no guarantee that Canada would prevail.
So it's a high-stakes gamble.
It is, yeah.
They could win and force the U.S. to back down,
Right.
but they could also lose and further escalate the conflict.
That's the risk.
Right. And there's also the risk that even if Canada wins a legal challenge, the Trump administration simply ignores the ruling or finds other ones to retaliate.
That's a possibility, too.
This situation is getting more and more complicated by the minute.
It is.
We've talked about the potential for a legal battle.
Right.
But before we go any further, I think we need to take a closer look at the potential impact of these tariffs on specific industries.
I think that's a great idea.
Can you give us some concrete examples?
Absolutely. Let's start with the auto industry, which is
Yeah.
highly integrated across the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier. You know how some cars are assembled with parts from both countries?
Right.
This could really mess up that whole process, right?
Exactly. A 25% tariff on Canadian-made cars and auto parts would likely disrupt supply chains, drive up costs for manufacturers,
Uh-huh.
and ultimately lead to higher prices for consumers.
Right.
It could even make some cars unavailable altogether.
Ouch, that's going to hurt anyone looking to buy a new car. What about other industries?
Well, lumber is another big one. Canada is a major supplier of softwood lumber to the U.S.,
Right.
and previous rounds of tariffs have already led to price increases for home builders and consumers.
So we're talking about a domino effect that could make everything more expensive?
It could, yeah.
From building a new house to buying furniture, this is getting pretty serious.
It is, yeah.
And then there's the agricultural sector.
Yeah.
Canada exports a significant amount of agricultural products to the U.S.,
Right.
including wheat, beef, and dairy. These tariffs could make Canadian products less competitive,
Yeah.
potentially harming Canadian farmers and pushing up food prices for American consumers.
Exactly.
Hold on, didn't Trump just sign this big new trade deal with Canada and Mexico?
He did that.
USMCA.
Yeah.
Shouldn't that offer some protection against this kind of thing?
You're right. The USMCA was supposed to provide a framework for resolving trade disputes
Right.
and preventing these kinds of unilateral actions.
Oh,
There's the catch.
what do you mean?
The USMCA also has provisions that allow the U.S. to impose tariffs on national security grounds,
Okay.
which is exactly what Trump is claiming in this case.
So it's like a loophole
It is, yeah.
that undermines the whole purpose of the agreement.
Yeah. In a way,
That's frustrating.
it is. It really highlights the unpredictable nature of U.S. trade policy under the Trump administration.
So we've talked about consumers feeling the pinch, businesses struggling,
Right.
and even the potential for a legal showdown.
Yeah.
But this all feels a bit theoretical. What are some possible real-world scenarios for how this could all play out?
That's a great question. Let's explore some possibilities. One scenario, perhaps the most optimistic, is that these tariffs are just a negotiating tactic.
You mean like Trump's playing a high-stakes poker game?
Yeah, kind of.
Threatening tariffs as a bluff to get Canada to make concessions on something else?
That's a possibility. He might not actually want to impose these tariffs,
Okay.
but is using them as leverage to get what he wants on trade, immigration, or other issues.
Okay, so in that scenario, how could things play out?
Well,
What kind of resolution are we talking about?
maybe Canada agrees to tighten border security even further,
Okay.
like increasing the number of Border Patrol agents or investing in new surveillance technologies.
Or perhaps they make some changes to the USMCA agreement itself,
Potentially.
like opening up certain sectors of the Canadian economy to more U.S. competition.
That's also possible,
Mm,
but we have to remember that any concessions Canada makes will likely come at a political cost.
sure.
If the Canadian public sees it as caving to U.S. pressure, it could hurt the ruling party's popularity back home.
So it's a tricky situation. Canada's got to protect its economic interests,
Yeah.
but also maintain its sovereignty and political standing.
It's a tough balancing act.
Tough balancing act.
Right.
Now, let's look at another scenario. What if Trump actually follows through with these tariffs?
Right.
Okay, buckle up, everyone. Things are about to get bumpy.
Yeah.
What happens if those tariffs actually hit?
Well, as we've discussed, the economic impact could be pretty severe for both countries.
Right.
We could see job losses, rising prices, and slower economic growth on both sides of the border.
And those industries we talked about, like the auto industry and lumber, those could be hit especially hard, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the longer those tariffs stay in place, the more damage they'll do. We could see businesses starting to move their supply chains away from Canada,
Yeah.
which would lead to lasting economic harm.
So this isn't just a short-term shock. It could actually reshape the entire North American economy.
That's right. And then there are the political consequences to consider.
Yeah, for sure.
These tariffs could strain U.S.-Canada relations, leading to more tension and distrust between our countries.
It's hard to see how this kind of action would promote friendship and cooperation, that's for sure.
Right. It could also affect Canada's relationships with other countries around the world if Canada is seen as being pushed around by the U.S.
Yeah.
They might be less likely to cooperate on international issues or support U.S. foreign policy initiatives.
So there's a potential ripple effect here. These tariffs could impact Canada's relationships globally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, there's a third scenario we need to consider, and this one's a little more complex.
Ooh, intrigue. Tell me more.
What if these tariffs were actually part of a larger strategy by the Trump administration to renegotiate trade with Canada, not just bilaterally, but within the entire USMCA agreement?
So you're saying this might be about more than just border security or the trade deficit?
Potentially.
Maybe Trump wants to rewrite the rules of the game entirely.
That's a possibility.
Yeah.
It's possible he's using these tariffs to force Canada back to the negotiating table,
Okay.
to gain concessions on a whole range of issues.
Well, we just talked about how the USMCA was renegotiated a few years ago.
I know.
What more could he possibly want?
Well, for example, he might want greater access to the Canadian dairy market,
Right.
which has been a sticking point for U.S. dairy farmers for a long time. Or he could be pushing for changes to Canada's intellectual property laws, which some U.S. companies see as too restrictive.
So this could be about fundamentally reshaping the trade relationship between the U.S. and Canada.
Exactly. And if that's the case, this situation could drag on for months, even years, without a clear resolution in sight.
Okay, so we've got three potential scenarios. A negotiated settlement where everyone compromises a full-blown trade war, and a drawn-out renegotiation of the USMCA. What do you think is the most likely outcome?
It's hard to say for sure. A lot depends on the political calculations on both sides of the border. If Trump thinks these tariffs will help him politically, he might be willing to follow through with them, even if it hurts both economies.
But what about public opinion?
Yeah.
Could that sway things one way or another?
Public opinion could definitely play a role. If enough people in both countries voice their concerns about the negative impacts of these tariffs,
Yeah.
it might put pressure on both governments to find a solution.
So our listeners actually have some power here. They can make a difference by contacting their representatives and making their voices heard.
Absolutely. Citizen engagement is crucial in situations like this.
And speaking of power dynamics, what if there's a change in leadership in the U.S.? How would that affect the situation?
That's a huge factor. A new president with a different approach to trade could completely change the game.
Okay.
They might be more open to negotiation or even scrap the tariffs altogether.
So there's a glimmer of hope there, but for now we're stuck in this uncertain waiting game with the threat of tariffs looming over us.
That's right. And that uncertainty itself can be damaging businesses, and investors might hesitate to make decisions not knowing what the future holds.
Okay, so we've looked at the possible scenarios, but there's one more big question we need to address.
I'm all ears.
Given how interconnected the global economy is, could these tariffs actually hurt American businesses and consumers as much as they hurt Canada?
That's a great question.
I mean, isn't everything connected these days?
That's a great question, and the answer is potentially yes.
Okay.
Tariffs on Canadian goods could very well raise prices for American consumers,
Right.
making everything from cars and building materials to groceries more expensive.
And that could lower demand,
It could.
which could lead to slower economic growth and job losses here in the U.S. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot.
Exactly. Plus, a lot of American businesses rely on Canadian suppliers and partners. Disrupting those relationships could really damage their profits
Yeah.
and make them less competitive globally.
So it's not just Canada that stands to lose from these tariffs. The U.S. economy could suffer too. It seems like a lose-lose situation for everyone.
It could be. That's why it's so important for policymakers on both sides of the border to really think through the potential consequences of their actions.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The potential economic and political consequences of these tariffs,
Right.
different ways this could all play out, and how interconnected the U.S. and Canadian economies really are.
Definitely.
But now I want to shift gears a little and focus on the human side of all this.
I think that's important. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and the political maneuvering,
Yeah.
but we have to remember that there are real people whose lives are being affected by this trade tension.
Exactly. So let's take a moment to hear from some of those people. We've got interviews with Canadian business owners,
Okay.
American consumers, and workers on both sides of the border who are all feeling the impact of this uncertainty.
I'm looking forward to hearing their perspectives. Their stories will help us understand the human cost of these trade disputes and the importance of finding a solution that works for everyone.
Welcome back, everyone. We've been unpacking this whole tariff situation between the U.S. and Canada,
Right.
and it's clear things are pretty complex.
Yeah, definitely a lot of moving pieces.
But before we wrap up, I think it's important to hear from some real people,
Absolutely.
get some human stories to help us understand the impact this could have on everyday lives.
I think those personal stories can be so powerful.
Exactly. So let's start by hearing from Sarah, a small business owner in Ontario. She relies on exporting her handmade goods to the U.S.
Okay.
And she's worried about how these tariffs could affect her livelihood.
Her story is a really good example of how interconnected our economies are and how, these tariffs can have ripple effects.
Right.
Reaching, far beyond the border.
Yeah.
And impacting small businesses and entire communities.
It really highlights the human side of trade and how policies made at the national level can have very real consequences for individuals just trying to make a living.
Yeah, those are the stories we need to remember.
Right, exactly. So we've heard from a Canadian business owner. Now let's shift perspectives and hear from Mike, an American consumer who's noticed prices going up on some of his favorite Canadian products.
Mike's experience is a good reminder that these tariffs could really affect everyone's wallet.
It's true.
Potentially making everyday goods more expensive
Right.
for consumers on both sides of the border.
Yeah, it's easy to think of tariffs as something abstract, but when you see it impacting the price of the things you buy at the store,
Right. It hits home.
yeah, it suddenly becomes very real.
It does. And it underscores the point we made earlier
Right.
about the potential for these tariffs to hurt American consumers, just as much as Canadian businesses.
Okay, so we've heard from a business owner and a consumer. Finally, let's hear from John, a worker in the U.S. auto industry who's concerned about the possibility of job losses if these tariffs are put in place.
John's story really brings home the potential human cost of these trade disputes.
Absolutely.
The uncertainty and anxiety that workers and their families are facing
Yeah, it's tough.
is a stark reminder of what's at stake here.
It's a reminder that these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about people's livelihoods, their ability to provide for their families,
Yeah.
their sense of security about the future.
Yeah. And it highlights the importance of finding a resolution that takes into account the needs of workers
Right.
in both countries.
Of course.
Not just the interests of corporations or politicians.
These are just a few of the many stories unfolding as this trade situation continues to develop. It's a reminder that behind the headlines and the political rhetoric, there are real people whose lives and livelihoods are being impacted.
And we have to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to stay informed and engaged as this story continues to unfold?
Well, I think first and foremost, stay informed.
Okay.
Read reputable news sources, follow experts who are providing insights, on social media, and most importantly, engage in thoughtful discussions about these issues.
Don't be afraid to reach out to your elected officials and, share your perspective.
Yes, definitely.
Let them know how these tariffs could affect you, your family, your community.
Your voice matters.
It does.
Make sure your representatives understand that you care about fair trade,
Yeah.
strong economic relationships, and maintaining a positive relationship with Canada.
This has been a deep dive, and we've definitely navigated some choppy waters today.
We have.
But I hope you're swimming away with a better understanding of what's at stake. This is a complex situation,
It is.
and there are no easy answers.
No. But by staying informed, staying engaged, and keeping in mind the human side of this story,
Right.
we can all play a role in shaping a future that benefits both our countries.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. Keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.